The dust of Redemption Gap settled on everything, a fine red powder that clung to sorrow and scripture with equal tenacity. It coated the brim of Eleanor Vance's sun-bleached bonnet and settled in the creases of her worn gingham dress, a dress that could no longer hide the gentle swell of her belly. She stood before the counter of Henderson's Mercantile, her spine straight, her hands clasped tight over her reticule, feeling the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes. The air was thick with the scent of dried beans, kerosene, and silent judgment. Silas Croft stood near the back, by the barrels of nails and coils of rope, ostensibly examining the quality of a horse blanket. In truth, he was watching the woman at the counter. He had seen her before, a solitary figure moving against the vast, unforgiving backdrop of the scrubland east of town. He'd noted the determined set of her shoulders, the way she carried herself as if bracing against a constant, invisible wind. Now, seeing her up close, he saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the faint tremor in her hands. "I'm afraid I can't extend any more credit, Mrs. Vance," Solomon Henderson announced, his voice loud enough to carry to every corner of the store. He polished a pair of spectacles with a cloth, not bothering to look at her directly. Times are hard for everyone. A murmur rippled through the assembled shoppers. It wasn't about hard times. It was about her husband, Thomas, struck down by a fever so swift it seemed like a judgment. And it was about the land he'd left her, that worthless, rock-strewn parcel everyone knew was tainted. "I'll have the money next month, Mr. Henderson," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but clear. "The garden is starting to come in." Henderson finally put on his spectacles and peered at her over the rims, his gaze dropping pointedly to her stomach. "A garden won't clear the debt you're already carrying, let alone what you'll need for what's coming. And nothing good grows on that land anyway. Cursed ground makes for a bitter harvest." The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Cursed. Eleanor flinched as if struck. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking as pale and fragile as a pressed flower. She could feel the stares, the mix of pity and morbid satisfaction on the faces of her neighbors. Goody Albright, whose preserves won the prize at the county fair every year, clutched her basket a little tighter and took a half step away. Jedediah Kane, a rancher with a greedy glint in his eye and land that bordered hers, watched from the doorway with a smirk. "It's not cursed," Eleanor whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. It was the prayer she recited every morning and every night. "Call it what you will," Henderson said with a dismissive shrug. "Bad luck sticks to that place like a tick on a hound. Thomas Vance was a fool to buy it, and a bigger one to think he could pull a living from it. Now look where it got him." The cruelty of it stole her breath. She took a half step back, her hand instinctively going to her belly, a protective shield against their words. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. With as much dignity as she could muster, she turned away from the counter, abandoning the small pile of flour and salt she'd hoped to acquire. She fled the store, her head held high, the word cursed clinging to her like the dust on her hem, unaware that a pair of quiet, calculating eyes had followed her retreat, missing nothing. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before the story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. The path back to her homestead was not a road, but a suggestion, a faint trail worn into the hard-packed earth by the hopeful steps of her late husband. Now it felt like a path to exile. Eleanor walked it with a heavy heart, the Mercantile's oppressive atmosphere still clinging to her. The sun beat down, and the heat rising from the ground seemed to mock her with its shimmering emptiness. This was her inheritance, a small, sturdy cabin built by Thomas's own hands, 20 acres of stubborn land, and a reputation for being marked by God's disfavor. The land itself was the source of the town's superstition. It wasn't the verdant pasture land of the valley ranches. It was higher, bonier ground, a place of granite outcrops, twisted juniper trees, and soil that seemed more rock than dirt. Thomas had seen something else. He'd seen the way the morning light caught the mica flecks in the stone, The hardy persistence of the wildflowers that grew in the crags, the pure, clean water that bubbled up from their spring. This land is character, he used to say, his hands tracing the lines on a piece of quartz he'd picked up. It's not flighty. It's got secrets. Good ones. But the secrets had seemed only to be cruel ones. Their first year, a blight had taken their corn. The second, their 2 milk cows had sickened and died. The townsfolk, led by the grim pronouncements of Reverend Miller, had started to whisper. They recalled old tales of prospectors who had vanished in these hills, of natives who avoided this specific patch of ground. Then, just 6 months ago, Thomas had woken with a chill, and by sundown he was gone. The whispers had become a chorus. The Vance land was cursed, and now she, his widow, pregnant with his child, was the curse's keeper. She reached the cabin, its pine logs baked to a silvery gray by the sun. It was small, but it was hers. Inside, it was clean and sparse. A stone hearth, a sturdy table Thomas had made, a rocking chair by the window. Her gaze fell upon a shelf where he had kept his favorite rocks. They weren't just rocks to him. He'd talked of strata and formations, words she didn't fully grasp but loved to hear him say. He had believed, with a prospector's unshakable faith, that there was more to this land than met the eye. Holding on to that belief was all she had left. The next morning, as she was pulling weeds from the small, struggling patch of earth she called a garden, she saw him, the man from the store. He was a good distance away, near the creek that marked the southern edge of her property. He wasn't ranching, wasn't hunting. He was doing something odd. He had a hammer, but not a carpenter's hammer. It was smaller, with one sharp, pointed end. He would walk a few paces, his eyes scanning the ground, then kneel, tap at a rock, and examine the pieces through a small looking-glass. She watched him for the better part of an hour, a knot of apprehension tightening in her chest. Was he another vulture like Jedediah Kane, looking for a way to pressure her off her land? He didn't look like Kane. He was leaner, quieter in his movements. He wore the sturdy denim and scuffed boots of a cowboy, but he moved with the focused patience of a scholar. Her vigil was interrupted by a harsh, grating screech from the well, followed by a sickening clunk. The handle went limp in her hand. The pump was broken. A wave of cold panic washed over her. The spring was a quarter-mile walk down a steep, rocky path. In her condition, hauling buckets of water up that incline would be dangerous, if not impossible. Tears of frustration pricked at her eyes. It was one more thing, another piece of evidence for the town that this place was determined to break her. She was still staring at the useless pump when his shadow fell over her. She spun around, her heart leaping in her throat. It was the man from the creek. He was closer now, and she could see his face clearly. It was a weathered, thoughtful face with kind eyes the color of faded denim. He held his hat in his hands, a gesture of respect that felt alien after the contempt she'd faced in town. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone. "Name's Silas Croft. I heard the pump." Eleanor clutched the useless iron handle like a shield. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. He didn't take offense. "Just wanted to offer my help, if you'll have it. I'm handy with machinery." He gestured vaguely back toward his camp, which was little more than a bedroll and a small tent tucked into a stand of cottonwoods by the creek. "I was camping nearby. Hope I wasn't trespassing." "This is private property," she said, the words automatic, a defense against a world she expected to be hostile. "I know," he said calmly. "That's why I'm asking now. For permission to fix your pump." She studied him, her fear warring with her desperation. He wasn't smirking like Kane. He wasn't preaching like Reverend Miller. He was just looking at her, waiting for an answer. The sun was hot on her neck, and the thirst she felt was suddenly very real. The baby shifted inside her, a small, insistent flutter. She was responsible for this life, too. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "You know how to fix these things?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly. "I've mended a few, and some mining equipment. It's all just levers and valves." He gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "I can't make it any more broken than it is." It was the simple logic of it that convinced her. She looked from his capable hands to the silent well, and then back to his steady gaze. She gave a single, sharp nod. All right. Silas set to work immediately. He disassembled the pump mechanism with a practiced efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was to ask for a wrench or a piece of oilcloth. Eleanor watched from the porch, a glass of water from her last full bucket on the small table beside her. As he worked, he would occasionally pause, pick up a stone from the ground around the well, and turn it over in his palm, his brow furrowed in concentration before he tossed it aside and returned to the task at hand. Within 2 hours, he had found the problem, a worn leather gasket and a sheared pin. He fashioned a new pin from a nail he straightened and filed down, and ingeniously repaired the gasket using a piece of leather from his own boot heel. When he reassembled it, he primed the pump, and with a few rhythmic strokes, a stream of clear, cold water gushed forth. The sound was the sweetest music Eleanor had ever heard. Relief washed through her so powerfully her knees felt weak. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to repay you." Silas wiped his greasy hands on a rag. "No repayment necessary, ma'am, but I would like to ask a favor." Her guard went up again instantly. "What is it?" He looked not at her, but at the rocky hills that rose up behind her cabin. "Your husband, he was a prospector, wasn't he?" The question surprised her. He believed there was something here. Gold, maybe. He spent all his spare time searching. Silas nodded slowly. "I'm a geologist." He saw the blank look on her face. "I study rocks, ma'am. The story they tell. Your land, it's unusual. The formations are complex. I consider it a great favor if you'd allow me to survey it. Just looking, chipping off a few samples. I'll stay well away from your cabin and your garden." This was not what she had expected. He didn't want money. He didn't want food, though he looked like he could use a square meal. He just wanted to look at her rocks. The same rocks everyone else scorned. It was so close to Thomas's own obsession that it felt like a strange echo, a ghost of a conversation she'd had 100 times. She looked at the gushing water, then at this quiet, capable man. He had shown her kindness when she had forgotten what it felt like. He had respected her land by asking permission. "All right, Mr. Croft," she said, the decision settling in her heart. "You can look at the rocks." A strange partnership began, unspoken and unacknowledged. Silas moved his camp a little closer, still keeping a respectful distance, but near enough that his small morning cook fire was a comforting plume of smoke on the horizon. Each day, he would set out with his hammer and his satchel, a solitary figure moving with purpose across the land that everyone else had abandoned. And each day, Eleanor found herself watching him. He was nothing like the men of Redemption Gap. He didn't swagger or boast. His quiet was not one of judgment, but of observation. She would see him kneeling for an hour in one spot, chipping away at an outcrop, then making meticulous notes in a small, leather-bound book. He worked with the devotion of a monk. In the evenings, he would sometimes approach the cabin, never coming onto the porch unless invited. He'd offer her something from his own meager supplies, a rabbit he'd snared, a handful of onions he'd bought on a rare trip to a neighboring town. At first, she was hesitant to accept, but his offerings were so matter-of-fact, so devoid of pity, that it felt less like charity and more like a simple, neighborly exchange. In return, she started leaving a bucket of fresh water for him at the edge of the yard. One evening, emboldened by a week of this silent routine, she offered him a bowl of stew. He accepted with a gratitude that was so genuine it disarmed her. They ate on the porch steps, the setting sun painting the cursed hills in hues of gold and lavender. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared space free from the prying eyes and sharp tongues of the town. "What story are they telling you?" she asked, breaking the quiet. Silas looked up from his bowl, surprised. "Mom?" "The rocks," she clarified. "You said they tell a story." A slow smile touched his lips. It transformed his serious face, making him look younger. "Well, right now, they're telling a long and complicated story of volcanic upheaval and sedimentary deposits. This whole area was once under a great sea. Then, immense pressure from below pushed it all up. He picked up a piece of granite from the edge of the porch. This stone here is ancient. It's the heart of the mountain. But it's the younger rock, the veins pushed up through it, that are usually more talkative. She didn't understand half the words, but she understood the passion in his voice. It was the same fire she had heard in Thomas's. Thomas used to say this land had secrets. He was right, Silas said, his gaze sweeping over the landscape. He was absolutely right. Their fragile peace was inevitably disturbed by the outside world. One afternoon, Jedediah Kane rode right up to her fence line, his horse trampling a patch of her struggling squash vines. He didn't dismount, looming over her from his saddle, the leather creaking like a threat. "Afternoon, Eleanor," he said, his smile oily. "Still trying to make a go of this godforsaken place, are you?" "It's my home, Mr. Kane," she replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. His eyes scanned the property, lingering on the mended pump, the tidy yard, and finally, on Silas, who was working his way up a ravine a few hundred yards away. Kane's eyes narrowed. "I see you've got yourself some help," he sneered. "Some drifter. You should be careful, a woman in your condition. A man like that might take advantage." "Mr. Croft has been a gentleman," she said stiffly. "Is that what he calls himself?" "Croft." Kane spat a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. "Look, I'm a neighbor. I'm concerned for you. This place is no good. The curse on it killed your husband, and it'll starve you and the babe. I'm prepared to make you a final offer. $50, cash, for the whole worthless plot. It's more than it's worth, but I'd do it out of Christian charity to get you out from under this dark cloud." $50. It was an insult. Even for cursed land, it was a pittance. It was just enough for a stagecoach ticket to nowhere with nothing left over. He wanted to steal it from her. Before she could form a reply, a shape detached itself from the ravine. Silas was walking toward them, his geologist hammer held loosely in his hand. He didn't hurry. He didn't shout. He just walked, his steady, deliberate pace more unnerving than any threat. Kane watched him approach, his smirk faltering. Silas stopped a few feet away, his gaze level and unreadable. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, a quiet, solid presence next to Eleanor. The silence stretched. Kane, accustomed to intimidating a lone woman, seemed at a loss. He was a bully, and bullies falter when faced with someone who doesn't flinch. He looked from Silas's calm face to Eleanor's defiant one, and his bravado crumbled. "Just an offer," he grumbled, pulling on his reins. "Think on it." He wheeled his horse around and galloped off, leaving a cloud of dust and resentment in his wake. Eleanor was trembling, a reaction to the adrenaline and the anger. She looked at Silas, who was still watching the dust settle where Kane had been. "Thank you," she said softly. He turned to her, his expression softening. He had no right. He glanced at her trampled squash vines. No right at all. That evening, he didn't wait for an invitation. He walked up to the porch, carrying 2 plump sage grouse, and said, "I believe we have cause for a celebratory dinner." As she cooked, and he plucked the birds, the small cabin filled with warmth and the scent of roasting meat. It felt more like a home than it had in months. She found herself telling him about Thomas, about his dreams for this place. He listened patiently, his gaze never leaving her face. In turn, he told her about his life back east in Philadelphia. He had been a geologist for a mining corporation, well-respected, with a bright future. But he had made a mistake. He'd endorsed a copper mining venture based on his analysis. The company had poured a fortune into it, but the vein had been shallow, a geological fluke. It petered out almost immediately, ruining the investors and his reputation. "I was so sure," he said, his voice quiet. "I trusted the science, but I missed something. I let my ambition cloud my judgment." He had come west to escape the shame, to get back to basics, to read the rocks without the pressure of a boardroom breathing down his neck. "So you're a man with a cursed reputation, and I'm a woman with cursed land," Eleanor said, a small, wry smile touching her lips for the first time in a long time. He met her gaze across the small table. "Maybe we're just 2 people who know what it's like to be misjudged." The connection between them deepened in the weeks that followed. It was a bond forged in shared solitude and quiet acts of service. He taught her how to read the clouds, to predict the rain by the smell of the air and the behavior of the birds. She taught him the names of the desert wildflowers and how to make biscuits that were light and flaky. Her pregnancy advanced, her body changing daily. With the changes came new fears and vulnerabilities. One afternoon, a wave of dizziness overcame her as she was hanging laundry. She stumbled and would have fallen, but Silas, who had been nearby reinforcing the fence, caught her. He held her steady for a moment, his hands firm and gentle on her arms. The world seemed to stop. She was acutely aware of his closeness, of the clean, earthy scent of him, of the strength in his hands. "Easy there," he said softly, his voice rough with concern. He guided her to the porch chair and fetched her a dipper of cool water. "You need to rest more." From that day on, he took the heavier chores from her without being asked. He hauled all the water, chopped the firewood, and mended the leaky roof on the small barn. He did it all with a quiet competence that asked for nothing in return. But he was getting something. He was getting a reason to stay. This land, and the woman on it, had become his purpose. His own work grew more and more intense. He no longer roamed the entire 20 acres, but concentrated on the steep-walled, narrow canyon at the far end of the property, the place the creek flowed through. He spent days in that canyon, sometimes coming back after dark, his clothes covered in dust, his knuckles scraped, but with a fire in his eyes she hadn't seen before. He was on the trail of something. The rocks were finally starting to talk to him, and he was listening with every fiber of his being. One evening, he didn't come back for dinner. Then the moon rose, and still he did not appear. A cold dread, familiar and sharp, gripped Eleanor. The canyon was treacherous, full of loose rock and steep drops. It was a place where a man could fall, could be trapped, could disappear, like the prospectors in the stories, like Thomas taken so suddenly. The curse. The words slithered into her mind, unwelcome and potent. Was it the land? Had she let this kind man walk into its trap? She lit a lantern, her hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the night. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. She was going after him. She didn't care if it was foolish, if it was dangerous. The thought of losing this newfound pillar in her life was more terrifying than any darkness or any curse. She followed the path to the creek, her lantern casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the rocks. "Silas," she called out, her voice thin against the vast silence of the night. "Silas." She heard a faint noise from up the canyon. A rhythmic tink, tink, tink. She scrambled forward, her cumbersome skirts catching on thorns, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound grew louder, more urgent. She rounded a massive boulder and saw him. He was in a small alcove, almost a cave, carved out by the creek during flood season. His back was to her, his own lantern casting a pool of golden light on the rock wall. He was hammering at a dark, metallic-looking vein that ran through the lighter granite. He hadn't heard her. He was utterly consumed. "Silas," she cried, relief making her voice crack. He jumped, whirling around, his eyes wide with surprise. When he saw her, his expression changed to one of alarm. "Eleanor, what are you doing out here? It's not safe. I thought something had happened to you," she said, leaning against the rock wall to catch her breath, her hand pressed to her side. He rushed to her side, his concern overriding everything else. "You shouldn't be out here, in your condition." He stopped, seeing the genuine fear in her eyes. He took the lantern from her trembling hand and set it down. "I was worried," she admitted in a small voice. His face softened. He reached out, his callous thumb gently brushing a smudge of dirt from her cheek. The gesture was incredibly tender. "I am sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. I found something. I lost track of time." He turned and led her to the rock face. He held his lantern up to the dark, glittering vein he had been working on. It wasn't just black. It was threaded through with something that caught the light with a brilliant, almost liquid sheen. "Look," he said, his voice hushed with reverence. "Do you see it?" She looked. It was pretty, she supposed. A dark, heavy-looking rock with shiny streaks in it. "What is it?" He took his hammer and chipped off a small, heavy piece. He held it out to her on the palm of his hand. It was surprisingly dense. "This," he said, his voice trembling with suppressed excitement, "is galena, lead sulfide." He saw her confusion. "But it's not just lead. Look at the silver in it. This is high-grade silver, or argentiferous galena." The technical words meant nothing to her. She only heard one. "Silver." "Silver," she repeated, her voice a whisper. "Not just a little, Eleanor," he said, his eyes glowing in the lantern light as he looked from the rock in his hand to her face. "Look at this vein. It's thick. It runs deep. I've traced it for 50 yards up the canyon floor. This isn't a pocket. It's a lode. A mother lode." He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. "Your husband was right. The town is wrong. This land isn't cursed." He took her hand, the one not holding the piece of ore, and closed his fingers around it. "Eleanor, this land is blessed. You're standing on a fortune." The weight of the rock in her hand suddenly felt immense, a tangible piece of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. Silver. Beneath the cursed ground, beneath the sight of all her sorrow and hardship, lay a secret of unimaginable brightness. She looked at Silas, at his face alight with the joy of his discovery, a discovery he was freely, eagerly sharing with her. The tears she had refused to shed in Henderson's store now streamed freely down her cheeks, not tears of sorrow, but of overwhelming, unbelievable hope. The discovery changed the air they breathed. The land, once a symbol of her struggle, now hummed with a secret promise. But Silas's excitement was tempered by a sharp edge of caution. The moment the word silver was spoken aloud, they were no longer just a lonely widow and a wandering geologist. They were guardians of a treasure, surrounded by wolves. "We have to be smart about this," he said the next morning, as they sat at her kitchen table, the lump of galena sitting between them like a holy relic. "The moment Kane or Henderson or anyone else gets a whiff of this, they'll do anything to take it from you. They'll claim you're incompetent. They'll try to have the land condemned. They'll invent a debt. We need to make this legal, ironclad, before we breathe a word." His methodical mind, the one that had failed him in the boardrooms of Philadelphia, was a godsend in the wilds of the West. He explained the process. They needed to stake the claim, marking its boundaries clearly. Then they had to take samples to the county seat, to the government assay office, and file the claim officially in her name. "In our name," Eleanor corrected him quietly. Silas looked up, his expression unreadable. "Eleanor, this is your land. The find is yours. Thomas found the land, but you found the silver," she stated, her voice firm. She had found her footing on this new, solid ground. "You came here when no one else would. You helped me. You believed when I was starting to doubt. Without you, that rock would have stayed in the canyon forever. It's ours, as partners." The word hung between them, rich with unspoken meaning. Partners. It was more than a business arrangement. It was a declaration of allegiance, a formal recognition of the bond that had grown between them in the shared silence and quiet acts of care. A slow warmth spread through Silas's chest. He had come west seeking rocks, a way to redeem his scientific mind. He hadn't expected to find a way to redeem his heart. He gave a single, decisive nod. Partners, then. For the next 2 days, they worked with a silent, focused intensity. Silas, using his compass and surveyor's chain, marked the boundaries of the claim, a rectangle that encompassed the canyon and the outcroppings he'd identified. He hammered wooden stakes into the ground, a quiet act of defiance against the land's reputation. Eleanor, her initial shock giving way to a fierce, protective determination, helped him, holding the chain steady, packing samples of the ore into canvas bags. The work was hard, but it felt joyful. It was the work of building a future. Their greatest fear was being seen. Jedediah Kane had taken to riding the perimeter of her property more frequently, his presence a constant, brooding threat. He would sit on his horse on the ridge opposite the canyon, watching. He couldn't see what they were doing in the narrow chasm, but their sustained activity clearly fueled his suspicion. "He knows something's up," Silas said, as they loaded the last of the sample bags onto his sturdy pack mule. "We need to go. Now. We'll leave before dawn tomorrow." The plan was simple. They would ride to the county seat, a full day's journey east. They would bypass Redemption Gap completely, taking an old, little-used cattle trail that would add miles, but keep them away from prying eyes. That night, an unseasonable chill fell. Eleanor couldn't sleep. The cabin, once her only sanctuary, now felt like a fragile shell. Everything hinged on the journey, on a piece of paper in a dusty office 40 miles away. She sat in the rocking chair, her hand resting on her swollen belly, where the baby kicked with a life of its own. It was for this child, for the memory of Thomas, for the unexpected kindness of Silas, that she had to be strong. She looked over at Silas, who was sleeping in his bedroll on the floor by the hearth, a place he'd insisted on taking since the night she'd gone looking for him. He had placed himself between her and the door, a silent guardian. In sleep, his face was unguarded, the lines of worry smoothed away. A powerful wave of affection washed over her, so strong it almost brought her to her knees. This man, who had come into her life by chance, had become its center. The ride to the county seat of Jasper was grueling. They set out in the pre-dawn gray, the air crisp and cold. Silas led the way on his horse, the pack mule trailing behind him. Eleanor followed on her own placid mare, the motion of the horse a steady, rocking rhythm. Silas constantly scanned their back trail, his body tense with vigilance. But the empty landscape remained empty. They spoke little, conserving their energy, communicating with glances and gestures. At midday, they stopped in a hidden arroyo to rest the horses and eat cold biscuits and jerky. So far, so good, Silas said, though his eyes never stopped moving. Do you really think Cain would follow us? Eleanor asked. Cain, or someone he paid, Silas confirmed grimly. A find as big, men have killed for less. A lot less, he looked at her, his gaze softening. But we're going to beat him, Eleanor. We're going to use the law. It's a tool, just like my hammer. And right now, it's the strongest tool we have. They reached Jasper as the sun was setting, casting long shadows down the town's wide, dusty main street. It was larger and busier than Redemption Gap, a place of brick buildings, saloons with swinging doors, and the imposing stone edifice of the county courthouse. They took a room at a modest boarding house, Silas insisting on a room for her and taking a spot in the stable for himself, not wanting to give anyone cause for gossip. But their caution came too late. As Eleanor was settling into her room, she glanced out the window and her blood ran cold. Across the street, tying his horse to a hitching post, was Solomon Henderson, the storekeeper. And standing with him, his face a mask of smug satisfaction, was Jedediah Cain. They hadn't followed them. They had anticipated them. They must have seen them leave and ridden hard on the main road, beating them here. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She flew to the door and ran down the stairs, nearly colliding with Silas in the hallway. He saw her face and knew instantly. They're here, she gasped. Henderson and Cain. Silas's jaw tightened. A muscle worked in his cheek. All right, this changes things. We can't wait until morning. The assay office is closed, but the clerk of records, the one who registers the claims, sometimes works late. We go now. He grabbed the heaviest of the sample bags. Stay close to me. They stepped out onto the boardwalk and into the deepening twilight. The air, which had felt full of promise moments before, now felt thick with menace. They walked quickly toward the courthouse at the end of the street, the sound of their boots echoing in the quiet evening. They didn't get far. Well, look what we have here. Cain's voice boomed from behind them. They turned. Cain and Henderson stood blocking their path, flanked by two rough-looking men Eleanor didn't recognize. A small crowd of onlookers, drawn by the confrontation, began to gather. Evening, Cain, Silas said, his voice dangerously calm. He subtly moved, so he was standing slightly in front of Eleanor. Don't you evening me, you swindler, Cain spat. We know what you're up to. Trying to trick this poor, grieving widow into signing away her land. He raised his voice for the benefit of the crowd. This man is a charlatan. He's taking advantage of a helpless woman, filling her head with stories of treasure to steal her husband's legacy. Henderson chimed in, his voice oozing false piety. We came all this way to protect her. The woman is clearly not in her right mind, addled by grief and this viper's lies. Her land in Redemption Gap is cursed, a place of sorrow. He's trying to get his hands on it for nothing. The crowd murmured, their faces a mixture of suspicion and morbid curiosity. An accusation of swindling a pregnant widow was potent stuff. They looked at Silas with open hostility. "That's not true," Eleanor said, her voice shaking but clear. Cain ignored her, pointing a finger at Silas. "I'll bet that bag is full of worthless rocks. Pyrite, maybe. Fool's gold to fool a grieving woman. Let's see it. Let's see the great treasure." He lunged for the bag. Silas sidestepped him easily, his body moving with a fluid grace that spoke of a life of hard, physical work. He held the bag out of Cain's reach. "This is none of your business, Cain. It is the business of any decent man to protect a woman from your kind." Cain roared, his face turning purple with rage. He signaled to his two hired men, "Get the bag." The two thugs moved forward, leering. The crowd gasped. This was escalating beyond words. It was about to become violent. And then, something inside Eleanor snapped. The fear, the humiliation, the months of being treated as a pariah, as a foolish, cursed creature. It all coalesced into a single, blazing point of anger. She was not helpless. She was not addled. And she would not let them do this. She stepped out from behind Silas, planting her feet firmly on the dusty street. She held her head high, her gaze sweeping over the crowd and settling on Cain. "Enough!" Her voice rang out, sharp and commanding. It was a voice no one, least of all herself, knew she possessed. The crowd fell silent. The two thugs paused, uncertain. "You talk about my husband's legacy," she said, her words clear and cutting as glass. "My husband's legacy is the belief he had in his land, a belief you all mocked. You called him a fool, and you called his land cursed because it was easier than admitting you were blind." She turned her fiery gaze on Henderson. "You talk about protecting me? You refused me a bag of flour on credit when you knew I had nothing. You shamed me in front of the whole town. Your concern is as empty as your heart, Mr. Henderson." She took another step forward, her hand resting on her belly. "And you, Mr. Cain, you don't want to protect me. You want to prey on me. You offer me $50 for my home. You try to scare me, to bully me, to steal what little I had left. You are not a protector. You are a vulture." A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was not the timid, broken widow they had imagined. This was a lioness. "This man," she said, turning to look at Silas, her expression softening into one of fierce loyalty, "is Silas Croft. He's a geologist, and he's my partner. He did not swindle me. He showed me the truth. He showed me what you were all too ignorant and too superstitious to see." She looked back at the stunned faces of Cain and Henderson. "My land is not cursed. It is rich, and this bag is not full of fool's gold." As if on cue, a door creaked open behind them. A small, bespectacled man in a green eye shade stood on the steps of the courthouse, a lantern in his hand. "There's a commotion out here," he said irritably. "The courthouse is closed." Silas recognized him. "Mr. Abernathy? My apologies. We were just on our way to see you. To file a claim." "A claim for what?" Abernathy asked, peering at the scene. Cain saw his chance. "A fraudulent claim, that's what. Based on lies and worthless rock." Silas met Eleanor's eyes. She gave a slight nod. He hefted the heavy canvas sack, walked up the steps, and emptied its contents onto the boardwalk at the clerk's feet. It wasn't a cascade of glittering gold. It was a pile of dull, heavy, dark gray rocks, streaked with veins of brilliant silver that glittered like trapped starlight in the lantern light. The crowd stared, speechless. The silence was absolute. Mr. Abernathy knelt, his bad mood forgotten, replaced by professional curiosity. He picked up the largest piece of ore, his eyes widening as he felt its heft. He was no assayer, but as the county clerk of records in a mining territory, he had seen enough or to know. "My word," he breathed, looking up at Silas and then at Eleanor. "My good word, this is Galena, rich as I've ever seen." He looked at Cain, his expression turning to one of disdain. Fraudulent, you say? Mr. Kane, I'd wager this single piece is worth more than your Christian charity. The dam of silence broke. The crowd erupted in a roar of murmurs and exclamations. The tide of public opinion, so swift and shallow, turned in an instant. The glares directed at Silas and Eleanor were replaced with looks of awe. The hostile suspicions shifted, landing squarely on Kane and Henderson, who now looked exactly like what Eleanor had called them, a vulture and a hypocrite, exposed in the sudden, brilliant light of the truth. Their power, built on whispers and fear, had been shattered by the simple, heavy reality of a rock. Kane stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, a man who had just watched a fortune slip through his grasping fingers. The curse was broken, not by a prayer or a spell, but by courage and the undeniable truth of the earth itself. In the quiet that followed the storm, Mr. Abernathy, now radiating an air of bustling importance, ushered them inside his dimly lit office. The claim was filed. Signatures were witnessed, papers were stamped, and a map was marked. It was official. The Vancecroft lode was legally theirs. The simple ink on the page felt like a fortress wall, protecting them from the greed of the world they had just faced down. The walk back to the boarding house was surreal. The town of Jasper, which had felt so menacing an hour before, now seemed to hold its breath around them. People peered from doorways, their whispers now tinged with awe instead of scorn. Kane and his men were nowhere to be seen, having melted into the shadows like the phantoms they were. They didn't speak until they were back in the hallway outside Eleanor's room. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and an even more profound sense of peace. "You were magnificent," Silas said, his voice soft with an emotion she couldn't quite name. It was more than admiration. It was reverence. Eleanor leaned her head back against the door, a weary smile on her face. "I just told the truth. It seems I'd forgotten what that felt like." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "We did it, Silas." "You did it, Eleanor," he corrected gently. "I just found the rock. You found your voice." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the piece of, or Mr. Abernathy had returned to him. He held it out to her. In the dim light of the hallway lamp, the silver veins seemed to glow with an inner life. It wasn't just a rock anymore. It was security. It was justice. It was the vindication of her husband's faith and the foundation of her child's future. She closed her hand around it, its weight cool and solid in her palm. "Ours," she said softly, but with unshakable conviction. "Partners." The journey home, the next day, was different. The land didn't seem as harsh, the sun not as punishing. They rode side by side, the pack mule unburdened, its precious cargo now registered and safe. A comfortable silence settled between them, the silence of two people who had faced down a dragon together and won. When their homestead came into view, the small cabin looked less like a place of exile and more like a bastion. It was home, truly, finally home. As they dismounted, the weariness of the journey fell away, replaced by a sense of beginning. They stood on the porch, looking out at the land as the evening sun began its slow descent. The hills, once a symbol of her curse, were now painted in soft, promising shades of rose and gold. They were no longer barren. They were full of secrets, as Thomas had said, good ones. Silas came to stand beside her, his shoulder almost touching hers. The air was still, holding the scent of dust and juniper and the faint, clean promise of rain on the wind. "What will you do now?" he asked quietly. She corrected him without looking at him. "What will we do now?" She felt his gaze on her. "We'll need to hire a crew. Bring in equipment. It will be hard work." "I'm not afraid of hard work," she said, her hand resting on the swell of her belly. The baby gave a gentle kick, a reminder of a new life that was intertwined with this new future. "I've had a lifetime of it." He was silent for a long moment. Then, he gently placed his hand on her shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of pity or even of comfort. It was a gesture of solidarity, of shared strength, an anchor in the quiet harbor they had built together. She leaned into his touch ever so slightly, a silent acceptance. They stood there for a long time, watching the last sliver of sun disappear behind the mountains, leaving the sky a deep, peaceful indigo. The world outside, with its judgment and its greed, seemed very far away. Here, on this small patch of once cursed ground, was everything that mattered. The land beneath their feet, the child on its way, and the quiet, unshakable partnership that had taken root and blossomed in the most unlikely of soils. The silver was just a metal in the ground. The real treasure was standing right here on the porch. I am a writer. I create stories like the one you've just experienced. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.